There is a lot to keep in mind when performing a hypothesis test. This video will pull together the key components and caveats that you need to know when going through this process. Let's go through the basic steps again for testing your hypotheses successfully. First, you write out the business question that you're trying to prove. Then, state the null and alternative hypotheses. After that, select an alpha level for your tolerance of making a type 1 error. At this point, you go and take a random sample of, just for purposes, at least 30 for a means test and at least 100 for a proportions test. Once you have your sample, you will perform the test and obtain the p-value if possible. Once you have the result of your test, state your statistical decision as to whether to reject HO or not reject HO. At this point, you will be in a good position to write out a managerial recommendation about your findings. Remember to be wary of the implications of making a type 1 or type 2 error. Now we need to consider a few specifics relating to this process. First, here are some sample hypotheses for a one-sample means test where we are looking for evidence that a population mean has changed in some way from 100. Notice that the equal sign is always present in the null HO hypothesis. This is the second rule of hypothesis testing and goes along with the idea that we perform the test to prove that something has changed from the status quo. Next, here are some sample hypotheses for a one-sample proportions test. We are looking for evidence that the population proportion has changed from 30%. Proportions tests can be tricky in that they can be confusing. You should also note that you should use a larger sample size, in most cases at least 100, for your test. Last, here are some sample hypotheses for a two-sample means test where we are looking for evidence that a population mean is now different for men and women. These type of tests can be performed, however, in real business context. They are usually done best with more sophisticated software. My next point assumes that you have collected your data and performed your test. We now look for the p-value. Recall the golden rule of hypothesis testing. If p is low, HO must go. Even if you do not create and perform the hypothesis test on your own, you can gain great insight by correctly interpreting the p-value. My suggestion here is for you to look at the hypotheses and make sure you understand what the business question or objective is. Can you state it in plain English? Can or has the author of the test clearly stated the objective? Then you should be able to look at the p-value and determine whether you should take action or not based on the hypotheses. Did the author clearly state what should be done as a result of their test? I also like to ask the question, what could go wrong? That is a simple way of saying, what are the implications of making a type 1 or type 2 error? You can only make a type 1 error when you first reject the null hypothesis. The general implication here is that you take action like launching a new product when you should not have. The type 1 error is more prevalent, particularly when you are reading someone else's work. A type 2 error can only occur when you do not reject the null hypothesis. The general implication here is of a missed opportunity. For example, you should have launched a new product, but the evidence from the test did not support that decision. Finally, hypothesis tests are complicated, but they can give you great insight to help you make better business decisions. So try to keep it simple.